It all began on the night of January 22nd. I used to work in an office in Florida. It was a service-based company, and my job as a database engineer often required me to work odd hours. On many nights, tasks needed to be completed in a live environment, so staying late, sometimes until midnight or even 2 a.m., wasn't unusual. That particular night, I was wrapping up a critical task with my team. It was nearing 2 a.m., and exhaustion hung in the air like a heavy fog. The database update was finally complete, and I decided to head home. As I stepped outside the office building, I realized my bike wasn't there. I had sent it for servicing earlier that day. A deathly silence surrounded me, broken only by the faint hum of distant streetlights. It was one of those nights where even the wind seemed to whisper secrets you weren't meant to hear. I hailed a Uber biker nearby to give me a ride home. He pulled up within a few minutes, and as he approached, I felt an odd chill ripple through me. His bike wasn't the one registered in the app. I always made it a habit to verify such things. When I asked about the discrepancy, he shrugged it off. "My usual bike broke down, so I borrowed this one," he said, his voice low and gravelly. There was something off about him. He wasn't wearing a helmet, and his appearance was disheveled. His salwar kameez looked rumpled and dirty, and an unbearable stench wafted from him. A smell that clung to the air, thick and rancid, like a decaying animal. It made my stomach churn, but I convinced myself it was probably just something rotting nearby. I climbed onto the bike, trying to ignore my growing unease. We took the familiar route, toward Kashmir Road, over the bridge, and past Sabzi Mandi. But then, as we reached a signal, he suddenly turned the bike toward a graveyard. "I need to stop here for a minute," he said, his voice strangely flat. "I know someone buried here. I need to recite the Fatiha." I hesitated, glancing around at the dark, empty road. "All right, but make it quick," I replied, my nerves prickling. He parked the bike near the graveyard, got off, and leaned against the wall, his head bowed. I watched him from a distance, my unease growing with every second. Something about the way he sat, motionless, almost statuesque, made my skin crawl. I wanted to leave, but he returned before I could voice my discomfort. As we resumed the ride, I tried to distract myself with small talk. "Do you drive full-time, or is this a side gig?" I asked. He didn't respond directly, instead muttering something under his breath. His tongue flicked strangely, and every now and then his body gave sharp, jerky movements like he was shivering, but it wasn't cold. Then he asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question caught me off guard. "Yes, I do. It's in the Quran, so I believe in them," I replied. He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You'll believe in them even more after tonight," he said cryptically. I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, he abruptly slammed the brakes, jolting me forward. He sat there for a moment motionless, then started the bike again, his movements slow and deliberate. "I know things," he finally said, "things most people don't. I talk to them, the spirits, the ones you fear." I felt my stomach drop. "Are you talking about black magic?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the faintest glint of a smile on his face. "Yes, I've done that too." Panic began to creep in. I silently started reciting prayers, my lips moving as I whispered verses from my faith. "Just drive faster," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to get home." He didn't speed up. Instead, he continued his eerie ramblings. "You don't believe me," he said, "but you will. Tonight you'll see." The air around us felt heavier, colder. I clenched my fists, willing the ride to end. Finally, as we neared my house, I asked him to stop a street before my compound. I quickly handed him some money, eager to get away. The night was stifling, the kind where the air felt thick and suffocating, refusing to let you breathe easily. As I lay on my bed, sweat clinging to my skin, the oppressive warmth seemed to press down on me like an invisible weight. The room was shrouded in an uneasy stillness, save for the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the window to my right. Their light cast faint shadows on the walls, but these shadows weren't ordinary. They moved in ways that defied logic, flickering and twisting as if alive. To my left, the cupboard stood in its usual place, but tonight it felt different. Something about it unnerved me. Peculiar, elongated shadows seemed to seep from its edges, stretching across the room like grasping fingers. Though the cupboard was no more than 2 feet wide, the shadows it birthed were vast and countless, slithering and writhing along the walls and floor. My throat tightened, and an inexplicable dread settled deep in my chest. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to exhaustion, but then it happened. My body froze. A crushing weight pinned me to the bed, and no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't move. My arms, my legs, everything was paralyzed, as though unseen chains bound me in place. Panic surged through me, and that's when the sound began. It started as a faint buzzing, like the hum of a honeybee, but it quickly grew louder, sharper, more sinister. The noise seemed to burrow into my ears, rattling my skull. Then came the whispers. Countless voices speaking at once, their words a chaotic jumble of tones and syllables I couldn't understand. They weren't human, I was sure of it. Some voices hissed, others growled, and a few sounded eerily childlike, but they all shared the same malevolent undertone. Tears streamed down my face as I fought against the invisible force holding me down. My lips trembled as I began to recite prayers, desperate for any kind of salvation. But the voices grew louder, drowning out my words, and the shadows on the walls seemed to swell and converge, their forms becoming more defined. For a moment, I swore I saw faces in the darkness, faces twisted in rage, hatred, and malice. The air in the room grew heavier still, pressing against my chest like a suffocating blanket. I could barely breathe, and the whispers turned into guttural, unholy laughter. My heart pounded against my rib cage, and I felt as though I might faint. And then, piercing through the chaos, I heard it, the Fajr Azan. The melodic call to prayer resonated through the still night, cutting through the buzzing and the whispers like a blade. As the first words of the Azan filled the air, the weight on my chest lifted, and the paralysis faded. The shadows writhed violently, retreating to the corners of the room as if burned by an unseen light. Within moments they were gone, swallowed by the darkness from which they had come. I lay there, trembling and drenched in sweat, trying to catch my breath. My body felt weak, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room. Mustering what little strength I had, I stumbled out, my legs barely carrying me. I made my way to the bathroom, performed ablution, and then headed straight to the mosque. The cool water on my skin and the rhythmic recitation of prayers brought me a semblance of peace, but the memory of the night lingered, haunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened wasn't over, that something had followed me, watching, waiting. The next day, I decided I couldn't keep it to myself. I confided in a local spiritual healer, an elderly man known for his deep knowledge of the unseen. As I recounted the events of that horrifying night, his expression grew grave. "You've encountered something supernatural," he said, his voice heavy with certainty. Dark forces, likely tied to black magic, have crossed your path. Whatever you experienced wasn't random, it was deliberate. Someone, or something, wanted to make its presence known. His words sent a chill down my spine. I had always believed in the supernatural, but belief is one thing. Experiencing it firsthand is another. I left his home with a mixture of fear and unease, unsure of what lay ahead. Even now, I can't look at shadows the same way. Every flicker, every movement in the corner of my eye sends my heart racing. Because now I know, sometimes the darkness hides things far more terrifying than we could ever imagine. I belong to the Hindu community, and this story dates back to the year 2016. At the time, I was pursuing my intermediate studies, and life, as far as I remember, had been normal. Peaceful, even. But everything changed after an incident involving my grandfather's wife, an auntie we had known for years. Our family lived in Hunza then, a quiet, serene place surrounded by towering mountains and rich traditions. This auntie had recently fallen on hard times and decided to move to Hunza. One day, she came to our house to meet my grandmother. It was a casual visit at first, but the strangeness began to unfold soon after. She came to our house several times over the course of 3 days. On the final day, she brought milk and some cakes with her, holding them carefully in her hands as she entered. After chatting with my grandmother for a while, she announced, rather abruptly, that she wanted to stay the night. Her house was barely 30 steps away, so close that she could easily have walked home. But she insisted. "No, I'll stay here tonight," she said, her tone firm. We didn't argue. Hospitality is a deeply ingrained part of our culture, and refusing a guest would have felt wrong. After dinner, we spread out the carpets and mats in the kitchen, as was our tradition. We didn't have furniture in the typical sense. Our family meals were always shared on the floor, a custom we all cherished. Once the meal was done, my grandmother offered to stay with her in the guest hall adjacent to the kitchen, but Auntie refused. "No need for that," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I'll sleep here alone. This is like my second home after all." Her words seemed harmless enough, but there was something unsettling about the way she looked around the room that night. She wasn't focused on us or even the conversation. Instead, her gaze kept drifting upward, toward the ceiling. Now, in Hunza, our homes typically don't have RCC cement or concrete roofs. Instead, they are built with wooden beams and planks. Auntie's eyes seemed fixated on the wooden beams above the cupboard, her stare unbroken and intense. Even when we offered her fruit after dinner, she continued to glance upward, barely acknowledging us. I was young at the time, still in my intermediate years, and though her behavior struck me as odd, I didn't think much of it. The night passed uneventfully, or so we thought, and the next morning, Auntie left without any fanfare. But after she left, things started to change in ways we couldn't have imagined. It began with small arguments. My mother and grandmother, who had always shared a harmonious relationship, started fighting over trivial things. At first, we dismissed it as the stress of daily life, but the arguments grew more frequent, more intense. What was once a peaceful home turned into a battleground overnight. The fights were bizarre. They weren't over anything meaningful, just minor misunderstandings that seemed to escalate without reason. My father often had to intervene to stop the shouting, but even he couldn't bring peace to the house. The atmosphere grew heavy, as if an invisible storm cloud had settled over us. Soon, my grandmother decided she couldn't take it anymore. She moved to a separate portion of the house, declaring, "I can't live with her anymore. She's harassed me enough. I need my own space." My father was deeply troubled by the situation. Our family had always been close-knit, but now we were fractured. The warmth that once filled our home was replaced by tension and unease. Things got worse. My mother started falling sick. At first, it was subtle, a sense of unease when she was inside the house. She would complain of stomach pain that came out of nowhere, a pain that no doctor could diagnose. Outside the house, she felt fine. But the moment she stepped through the door, her health would deteriorate. "I don't know what's happening," she confided in me one day. "I feel like running away from this house and never coming back." As the months passed, her condition worsened. September turned to October, and then November, but the strange occurrences continued. The house felt heavy, oppressive, as if it were haunted by an unseen force. My mother, once vibrant and strong, became a shadow of herself. One day, when her pain became unbearable, she decided to visit a hospital near my grandmother's house for a checkup. I accompanied her, hoping for answers, but the doctors found nothing. "You're perfectly fine," they said, prescribing medicines that did little to ease her suffering. After the hospital visit, we went to my maternal grandmother's house. My mother, visibly upset, hesitated to share the details of what was happening at home. But eventually, she couldn't hold it in. She told my grandmother everything, about the fights, the tension, her unexplained illness, and the sadness that seemed to hang over our house like a dark cloud. "I don't know what's wrong," she said, her voice trembling, "but I feel like someone has done something to us. Something unnatural. Ever since that auntie came to stay, everything has fallen apart." My grandmother listened intently, her expression growing more serious by the minute. "It could be black magic," she said finally. She then mentioned an elderly woman who lived on a nearby mountain, a woman known for her spiritual knowledge. People often went to her for guidance in times of trouble. "We'll visit her," my grandmother decided. The next day, my mother, grandmother, and I made our way to the elderly woman's home. The climb to her place was steep, and the air grew colder as we ascended. When we arrived, she greeted us with a calm, knowing smile, as if she had been expecting us. Without us saying much, she took one look at my mother and said, "There's a disturbance in your house. Something has been placed there, a dark force that's feeding on your family's harmony." She handed my mother a bottle of water and a thread, instructing her to use them with specific prayers. "This will help cleanse your home," she said, "but you must act quickly. The longer you wait, the stronger it will grow." The spiritual healer handed us a bottle of dumb water and a blessed thread, his demeanor calm but firm. "Take this water," he said, "and sprinkle it around your house. Drink some of it as well. Recite Ayatul Kursi and other prayers. This will help cleanse the negative energy surrounding your home." He placed his hand gently on my mother's head, closed his eyes, and whispered prayers that seemed to fill the room with a strange, tranquil energy. My mother, who had been weighed down by sickness and sadness, suddenly looked up with a sense of relief. "I feel lighter," she said, her voice trembling. "It's as if a burden has been lifted." We returned home that evening. It was December, and the cold air wrapped around us as we entered the house. My mother immediately distributed the water as instructed. We each drank from the bottle, the cool liquid soothing but strangely heavy, as though it carried more than just water. My father then sprinkled it around the house, paying extra attention to the corners, reciting Ayatul Kursi aloud as he moved from room to room. For a moment, it felt like the dark cloud that had been suffocating our home had started to lift. But that night, everything changed. Just as we settled in for the night, my mother's health suddenly took a turn for the worse. The relief she had felt earlier disappeared as if it had been an illusion. She became gravely ill, unable to stand or even sit up. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, and she could barely whisper through the pain. We were terrified. My father, his face stricken with worry, instructed us to get ready. "We need to take her to the hospital," he said urgently. "This is getting worse. She might need to be admitted." We scrambled to prepare. My mother was too weak to move, so my father and I helped her into the car, laying her carefully in the front seat while the rest of us climbed into the back. The road outside our gate was narrow, as was common in our village, with just enough space for 1 or 2 vehicles to pass. My father parked the car on the roadside, ensuring we were ready to leave quickly. As he checked on my mother one last time, the quiet night was suddenly shattered. Out of nowhere, a tractor appeared, rumbling down the road at an alarming speed. Before any of us could react, it collided violently with the front of our car. The impact was devastating. The door was torn apart as if by an invisible force, metal screeching and bending in ways that seemed almost unnatural. The driver of the tractor, someone we knew, stumbled out, his face pale and filled with shock. "I don't know what happened," he stammered. "It was as if something pulled the tractor toward your car." We were shaken, staring at the wreckage in disbelief. My father, always practical, wasted no time. He tied the broken door back to the car as best as he could, and we made our way to the hospital. At the hospital, my mother was admitted immediately. The doctors ran tests but found nothing wrong. Her health, however, began to improve within hours. By morning, she was sitting up, talking, and looking like her usual self. It was as though the illness that had gripped her so fiercely had simply vanished. "Let's go home," my mother said with renewed energy. "I feel fine now." We returned home cautiously, still shaken by the events of the night. As we stepped inside, the house felt different, quieter, calmer, but none of us dared to feel relieved. That evening, my aunt and brother went to check on our goats and cows in the garden. Our land in Hunza wasn't flat like the open fields of Punjab. It was a terraced mountain farm, where layers of land were painstakingly carved out by building retaining walls to create small plots for cultivation. The winter had stripped the garden of its greenery, but the goats and cows still roamed there during the day, searching for scraps of food and getting some exercise. As my aunt and brother approached the garden, they noticed something strange. One of our goats had recently given birth to 2 kids. The little ones were always nearby, huddling close to their mother. But that evening, the goats were nowhere to be found. My aunt and brother searched every corner of the garden, their calls echoing into the cold air. They scoured the area, even venturing down the terraced lands to see if the animals had wandered further. The terraced land, carefully maintained for years, had collapsed. The retaining walls had crumbled, and the layers of earth had slid down the mountain as if pushed by an unseen force. Where once there had been solid ground, there was now only destruction, an unrecognizable slope of broken earth and stone. The animals were gone. No trace of the goat or her kids could be found. It was as though they had been swallowed by the earth itself. When my aunt and brother returned to the house to share what they had seen, their faces were pale, their voices trembling. "It's not normal," my aunt said. "It feels wrong, like something is working against us." The following days were tense. The house, though seemingly calm, felt haunted by an invisible presence. My mother, though recovered, avoided staying inside for too long. She would step out into the garden or sit in the open air, saying it felt stifling within the walls of our home. We couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had gripped our family wasn't over. The dumb water, the prayers, even the visit to the healer had offered temporary relief, but the lingering sense of unease remained. And as we pieced together the strange events, the fights, the sickness, The tractor accident and now the landslide, we couldn't help but wonder if they were all connected. Was it black magic? Was it a curse? Or was it something even more sinister, something beyond our understanding? The land we had painstakingly cultivated, the terraced garden that had been a source of pride and sustenance, had slid down the mountain, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. My aunt, standing at the edge of the chaos, clutched her head in despair. The goats were gone, and with them, the hopes of recovering what little was left. "It's a disaster," my brother muttered as he and my aunt combed through the remains of the garden. The walls and gates surrounding the area were intact, so the animals couldn't have escaped. Desperation drove them deeper into the jungle-like thicket on one side of the garden. In that part of the property was a pool we used to irrigate the land. Though not a swimming pool in the modern sense, it was deep enough to hold water, surrounded by fallen autumn leaves. My brother approached it cautiously, the still water reflecting the gray December sky. And then he saw it. The goat and her 2 kids lay lifeless in the pool, tangled in the decay of wet leaves and debris. Their bodies, eerily still, spoke of yet another loss, a third in as many days. My brother's shout rang out, breaking the heavy silence. "They're here," he yelled, his voice shaking. "They're dead, all of them." When they returned home with the grim news, showing the photos to my father, his face darkened with a mix of anger and worry. "This isn't natural," he said, pacing the room. "There's something more to this, something we can't see." My mother, sitting nearby, seemed suddenly pale. "Ever since we drank that water, I've been feeling strange, almost like I'm being attacked," she said, trembling. "We need to call that woman, the spiritual healer. Something is wrong." Later that afternoon, my grandmother, who had been resting, woke up abruptly and rushed to our section of the house. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I had a terrible dream," she said, her voice breaking. "Something bad is going to happen to us if we don't act. I won't fight with anyone anymore, I promise. But we must do something about this, now." The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. My mother and grandmother decided we couldn't delay any longer. That evening, we prepared to visit the spiritual healer again, this time with my father and cousins joining us. Fear lingered in the air as we packed into 2 jeeps, apprehensive about what might happen on the journey. My father, always cautious, warned us, "Drive carefully. We've had too many accidents already." When we arrived, the healer greeted us with a grave expression, as if she had been expecting our return. "I knew this was coming," she said solemnly. "A powerful spell has been cast on your family. An amulet has been hidden in your house, and it's drawing in dark energy." She paused, looking at each of us. "This spell was meant to take either your lives or your wealth. It's only by some divine grace that you've been spared so far." Her words sent chills through us. "What can we do to stop it?" my grandmother asked. The healer handed us a small bottle of oil and a cotton ball. "Burn this cotton in various places around your house," she instructed. "If the flame burns blue or yellow, the area is clean. But if it turns black, that's where the amulet is buried. Dig it out and destroy it." She paused again, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There's another one, buried beneath the main gate of your house. That one must also be found and burned." The search. We returned home that night, the air thick with dread. My cousins, grandmother, mother, and brother headed to the main gate while the rest of us focused on the hall room. That room had always felt unnerving, especially since the night when the auntie had stayed there, staring at the ceiling for hours. The hall room was large, with a cupboard that stored crockery in boxes. We began our search, turning the room inside out. We checked inside teapots, cushions, and even under the carpet, but found nothing. Frustration was mounting when a memory struck me like lightning. That auntie, she kept staring at the ceiling above the cupboard, I said aloud. What if it's hidden up there? My father, tall and determined, fetched a stool and climbed onto it, reaching toward the top of the cupboard. It was far back, a place no one would casually touch. As he moved his hand across the surface, his fingers brushed against something unusual. "I found it," he said, his voice low and tense. He pulled out a tightly wrapped bundle, bound with red and black cloth. It was heavy, shaped like a clenched fist, and emanated an almost tangible malice. We stared at it in horror, the realization sinking in. This was it, the source of our torment. The final step. We followed the healer's instructions to the letter. The cotton ball burned yellow and blue in most parts of the house, but when we burned it near the main gate, the flame turned black, the smoke thick and acrid. My father and brother dug feverishly beneath the gate's pillar until they unearthed another amulet, similar to the first but even darker in its aura. The healer had warned us about the dangers of handling such items. We took the amulets to an isolated spot, doused them in oil, and set them ablaze. The flames roared unnaturally high, and for a moment it felt as though the air itself was screaming. But as the fire consumed the amulets, a strange calm settled over us. We returned home, exhausted but hopeful. The house felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. My mother's health began to improve, and the tension that had plagued our family for months started to fade. The aftermath. In the days that followed, we pieced together what had happened. The auntie who had stayed with us had likely planted the amulet during her visit, her intentions cloaked in the guise of familial warmth. Why she had done it, we could only speculate. Jealousy, spite, or something even darker. Though the damage to our land and livestock could never be undone, we were grateful to have survived. The healer's words echoed in our minds. By some divine grace, you were spared. Even now, whenever I pass by the hall room or the main gate, a shiver runs down my spine. It's a reminder of how close we came to losing everything, and of the unseen forces that sometimes linger just beyond our understanding. As I stood there, clutching the amulet wrapped in red and black cloth, a chill ran down my spine. The air around us felt heavy, oppressive, as though the weight of what we had uncovered was pressing down on us all. My father joined the others at the gate, where they were pouring oil onto a piece of wood tied with rope, readying it to burn the evil away. The night had grown colder, and the wind was howling like a wounded animal. It wasn't just the cold that made me shiver. The atmosphere itself felt charged, alive with a malevolent energy that sent chills through every fiber of my being. The sky was dark and stormy, with clouds swirling unnaturally, casting strange shadows on the ground. The scene looked as though it had been plucked from the depths of a nightmare. My brother was holding a billiard tool, using it to dig into the frozen soil near the left pillar of the gate. The earth was stubborn, hardened by the bitter December cold, but the urgency of the moment drove him on. Each strike of the tool against the ground echoed unnervingly in the silence between gusts of wind. As the hole deepened, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. And then it happened. Black smoke began to rise from the ground, a thick, ominous smoke that smelled of decay and something far worse. It coiled and twisted like a living thing, sending a wave of dread through everyone present. The flame they had lit near the pillar burned higher, flickering with an unnatural intensity as the smoke seemed to reach for it. "What is that?" my cousin whispered, his voice trembling. "It's here," my father muttered, his face pale but resolute. After a few more agonizing minutes of digging, my brother's tool struck something hard. Carefully, he unearthed a bundle wrapped in several layers of black plastic. It was tied tightly, as though whoever buried it wanted to ensure it would never be disturbed. With hesitant hands, he peeled away the layers, revealing what lay within. It was a goat's head, grotesque and decayed, its eyes hollow and lifeless. Its tongue lolled out unnaturally, and in its mouth was a lemon pierced with 7 sharp needles. The sight was horrifying, a macabre symbol of the black magic that had plagued our family. We were frozen in place, staring at the cursed object. My father was the first to speak. "We need to burn it," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Now," he called the spiritual healer, explaining what we had found. Her voice was calm but urgent. "Take it far from the house," she instructed. "Burn it in an open field with the oil and straw, but remember this. Once it's burning, do not, under any circumstances, turn back. If you look back, you'll invite the evil back into your lives. No matter what you hear, no matter what you feel, keep moving forward." My father decided he would handle it himself, but my mother insisted on going with him. "We'll do this together," she said, her resolve unshaken despite the fear in her eyes. They took the cursed object to a nearby field, carrying the oil and straw. My cousin and I followed them part way, watching from a distance as they prepared to destroy the evil that had haunted us for so long. The wind picked up as they lit the fire, and the flames roared to life, engulfing the goat's head and its grotesque contents. The smoke turned thick and black, rising into the night sky like a dark omen. My mother and father recited Ayatul Kursi and other prayers, their voices steady despite the palpable tension. But as the fire consumed the cursed object, the air around them seemed to shift. My mother later described it as a sudden heaviness, as though unseen hands were holding her down. "It felt like my body was filled with lead," she said. "My legs wouldn't move, and I could barely lift my arms." My father experienced the same. Each step they tried to take felt as though they were dragging heavy stones tied to their feet. The wind howled louder, carrying with it faint whispers, voices that didn't belong to the living. "Don't look back," my father urged, his voice strained. "Keep walking, just keep walking." My mother stumbled on a rock, falling to the ground. Panic gripped her as she struggled to get up, the weight on her body almost unbearable. My father reached out to help her, repeating the healer's warning like a mantra. "Don't look back. Don't look back." They recited holy verse over and over as they forced their way forward, step by agonizing step, until they finally reached the gate of our house. Once inside, the heaviness lifted, as though an invisible chain had been broken. Following the healer's final instructions, they washed their faces and hands with salt water and changed into clean clothes. The clothes they had worn during the ritual were left outside, to be washed in the morning. For the first time in months, the house felt calm. It was as though a suffocating darkness had been lifted, replaced by an almost tangible sense of peace. The next day, my mother woke up smiling, a rare sight after the ordeal we had been through. My grandmother, too, seemed lighter, her usual quarrels and complaints gone. The fights, the tension, the sickness, all of it had vanished. "It feels like spring," my mother said, despite the biting December cold. Grateful for the healer's help, my mother visited her again to offer thanks and gifts. She also had one burning question. Who had done this to us? The healer hesitated before answering. "The person you suspect," she said carefully, "is the one responsible. I won't name names, but your instincts are correct.